Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at Galatians chapters 1 and 2. You mentioned these are really worth digging into.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
They feel like ancient history, but honestly, there's so much in there about the early church foundations that still, well, it still resonates today, doesn't it?
It really does. We're going to try and get into a really key moment, I think, when the apostles were kind of nailing down their core message, their mission.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how they did that through, personal stories, debates, and finally agreement. It wasn't straightforward.
Okay, so for you listening, we've kind of got three main things we want to pull out today. First, just how crucial they saw the true gospel message, like non-negotiable.
Can't stress that enough.
Second, this may be surprising focus on caring for the poor. It's really prominent.
Yeah, it really jumps out when you see where it's placed.
And third, how all this led to a very personal sense of calling, a call to action for them.
Right. These weren't just ideas. They led to real-life changes and, well, action.
So let's jump into chapter 1, Paul's opening. It's pretty fiery, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. He doesn't ease into it. He's immediately expressing shock.
Astonishment.
Yeah, verse 6. I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you. Astonished almost feels mild for what follows.
I know it does, because he ramps it up really quickly. He says flat out, there is no other gospel.
Right.
And then verse 9, he repeats it basically. If anyone is preaching you a gospel contrary, let him be accursed.
Accursed. Wow, that's intense. To hell with him, essentially.
Exactly.
So what was so vital about this specific message that any other version deserved that kind of reaction?
Well, the core issue was salvation itself. How does someone get right with God? Some people were adding conditions, weren't they?
The Jewish law stuff, circumcision for Gentiles.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Paul saw that as undermining the whole point of grace through faith in Christ. He argues, like in verses 11 and 12, that his gospel wasn't human guesswork.
Yeah. I did not receive it from any man, but through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Exactly. He's claiming divine origin, direct line.
So this isn't just a disagreement over practice for him, it's fundamental.
Totally. And to drive that home, he brings up his own backstory, verses 13 to 17.
Right, how he used to be the zealous persecutor, a complete 180.
Yeah, he reminds them of his past life, persecuting the church like crazy. And then crucially, after his conversion experience, he didn't run off to Jerusalem to check in with the established apostles.
He went to Arabia first.
Right. Arabia, then Damascus.
Oh, yeah.
Only later did he meet Peter and James.
So he's building this case step by step. Look, my transformation was radical, and the message I got wasn't filtered through the existing leadership. It was direct.
You got it. He's establishing his independent authority, saying his apostleship and his message came straight from the risen Christ, not secondhand.
Okay. So that's the unshakable stand on the gospel itself. But then, chapter 2, he does go to Jerusalem eventually. Why? After emphasizing his independence so much.
That's a great point. Because while his message was divinely given, unity was also, well, it was vital for the movement, wasn't it?
Oh, okay. Didn't want splinter groups right at the start.
Exactly. A split would have been disastrous. So 14 years on, Galatians 2.1, he heads to Jerusalem with Barnabas and significantly with Titus.
Titus. And he was Greek, uncircumcised.
Yep. He's the walking, talking example of Paul's point. A Gentile believer accepted by faith alone.
Kind of a test case then. Bold move.
Very. Paul laid out the gospel he preached to the Gentiles, making sure it aligned fundamentally with the Jerusalem leaders.
But there was tension, right? Verse 4 mentions false brothers.
People who'd snuck in, pushing for circumcision as essential, creating friction.
And Paul's reaction, did he compromise?
Not one bit. Verse 5 is clear. To them we did not yield in submission even for a moment. Why it then? So that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you.
Again, incredibly strong. The truth of the gospel itself was on the line.
Absolutely. Giving in would mean changing the gospel from grace to works. That different gospel he condemned right at the start.
But then comes this breakthrough moment. Verses 6 to 9. James, Peter, John, the big names, the pillars.
Yeah, and they recognized something crucial. They saw the grace God had given Paul, specifically for the Gentiles.
Just like Peter had a specific ministry to the Jews.
Exactly. They acknowledged these distinct callings. They saw God was working powerfully through Paul, just as he was through Peter.
And that leads to the right hand of fellowship.
A really powerful symbol of unity and acceptance. They basically endorsed Paul and Barnabas's mission to the Gentiles.
That must have been huge. The core leaders, despite different focus areas, coming together, validating Paul's work.
Absolutely critical. It prevented a potentially massive split right down the middle over what the gospel actually was. Getting that message right was everything for Paul.
And right after this major agreement on doctrine and mission, it comes verse 10. Almost sounds like an afterthought, but maybe not.
No, definitely not an afterthought. Only they asked us to remember the poor.
Simple phrase, but the placement is significant, isn't it? Right after settling the gospel truth.
Extremely significant. Think about it. First, it was unanimous. All the key leaders agreed on this.
Okay.
Second, it's mentioned right alongside the core gospel agreement. Not tacked on later, but part of that conversation.
And third?
Paul's reaction. He wasn't like, oh, okay, another thing to do. He says it was the very thing I was eager to do.
Eager. That word stands out. So this wasn't a new instruction for him. It was already his passion.
Seems so. Which begs the question, where did this passion for the poor come from in the early church? Why was it so central?
Good question. What did the sources suggest?
Well, fundamentally, it seems tied to the gospel itself. Think about 2 Corinthians 8:9.
Yeah.
The verse about Jesus.
Join me.
Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich.
Ah, right. The idea that experiencing God's grace, his selfless giving, changes your heart.
Exactly. A heart transformed by that kind of grace naturally overflows with compassion, especially towards those in need. It's almost an inevitable consequence.
That makes sense.
Grace received leads to grace extended.
And beyond that core theology, they had Jesus's direct example and teaching constantly in mind.
Like what, specifically?
Well, Matthew 25 is huge, isn't it? The judgment scene. I was hungry and you gave me food, thirsty and you gave me drink.
Stranger, naked, sick, in prison.
Yeah.
And Jesus says doing it for the least of these is doing it for him.
Right. A direct link between compassion for the vulnerable and relationship with Christ. It's unavoidable.
Were there other examples?
Oh, plenty. Luke's gospel is full of them. Remember Zacchaeus. When he gets saved, his immediate response is giving half his possessions to the poor.
And Jesus approves, right? Salvation has come to this house.
Yep. Or Luke 14, where Jesus tells people hosting dinners to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, those who can't repay you.
Because your reward comes from God. Exactly. And even Jesus' first sermon, quoting Isaiah in Luke 4, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to proclaim good news to the poor." It's right there at the start of his ministry.
So it wasn't just a side project. It was woven into the fabric of Jesus's message and life.
Absolutely central. And this concern wasn't just limited to fellow believers either.
How so?
Galatians 6:10 says, "Do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." So, yes, a priority for fellow Christians, but the call is to do good to everyone.
Okay.
And Romans 12:20 even says, "Feed your enemy if they're hungry. Give them drink if they're thirsty."
That's radical compassion, born directly from the gospel message.
Pretty much. So remembering the poor wasn't just the Jerusalem leaders being nice. It was a fundamental expression of the faith they had just agreed upon.
Which brings us nicely to that last point, the call to preach. How does all this, the pure gospel, the care for the poor, connect to actually sharing the message?
Well, think about the core promise in Romans 10:13. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Amazing promise.
Universal.
But then Paul immediately asks those logical questions in verses 14 and 15. How can they call if they haven't believed?
How can they believe if they haven't heard?
And how can they hear unless someone tells them, preaches?
And how can someone preach unless they're sent?
Right.
It creates a chain of necessity.
Exactly. The promise itself demands proclamation. Someone has to carry the news.
And Paul saw himself in that chain, didn't he?
Absolutely. Back in Galatians 1, verses 15 and 16, he links his revelation directly to his mission. God revealed his Son to him so that he might preach him among the Gentiles.
The revelation wasn't just for him personally. It came with a purpose, ascending.
Precisely. His encounter led directly to his calling.
And there's a connection made in the sources, isn't there, to the situation today? Something about the unreached and the poor.
Yeah, it's quite stark, actually. Often, the places with the least access to the Christian message, what's sometimes called the 1040 window, are also the areas facing the most extreme poverty.
So the people who haven't heard the message are often the same people facing the greatest material needs.
Frequently, yes. The overlap is significant. So, if you're serious about reaching the unreached with the gospel, you often find yourself simultaneously called to address profound poverty and suffering.
It really pulls everything together, the gospel truth, the compassion in action, the call to share it. They're all interconnected.
They really are. It seems the call involves, well, loving people in their need, trusting the gospel's power, and depending on God to lead and provide for that work. It's all intertwined.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Galatians 1 and 2, hopefully a few things stand out for you listening. First, just how incredibly important that core gospel message was, uncompromising.
Foundational.
Second, how that message wasn't separate from practical care. That link to remembering the poor was immediate and vital.
Inseparable, really.
And finally, this sense of a call that flows out of experiencing that gospel, a call to share it, especially with those who haven't heard, often in places of great need.
Which leaves us with a thought, perhaps a challenge, for you to reflect on. Given how tightly the early church, people like Paul and Peter and James, wove together gospel truth and tangible compassion, how does that sit with your own understanding?
How integrated are those two priorities, faithfulness to the message and active care for the vulnerable in your own faith, your own actions?
It's worth thinking about, isn't it? How their example might challenge or maybe reshape how we approach faith and its impact on the world around us today.
Definitely something to mull over. We really encourage you to keep exploring these themes. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.